So we return with Valzhyna Mort's Belarusian I. Now, we are going to start with the third stanza, but we'd ended talking about Soviet era surveillance. The thing is, unlike most East European countries, Belarus retains a lot of Soviet era practices. And so it is a critique of that mindset that continues to pervade modern Belarus. So that stanza. Completely free only in public toilets, where for a little change nobody cared what we were doing. We fought the summer heat, the winter snow. When we discovered we ourselves were the language and our tongues were removed, we started talking with our eyes. When our eyes were poked out, we talked with our hands. When our hands were cut off, we conversed with our toes. When we were shot in the legs, we nodded our heads for yes and shook our heads for no. And when they ate our heads alive, we crawled back into the bellies of our sleeping mothers, as if into bomb shelters to be born again. This is possibly the most blatantly dark and violent of all the stanzas that we have. Or rather, physical violence that's sort of being represented for us over here. Now, the opening line of this stanza is quite heartbreaking. Completely free only in public toilets, where for a little change nobody cared what we were doing. Now, the idea that bathrooms are one of the few places where you don't find cameras. At least, you don't. You're not supposed to. So the idea is that you are somehow free in the bathroom and you can freely do whatever you want to in the bathroom. And the thing is that for a lot of people, this does become a space where they express themselves. Bathroom graffiti is a thing. You find it in school bathrooms, you find it in college bathrooms, you find it in airport bathrooms. Alright, of course airports, you still clean it up, but school and college bathrooms, yes. And a lot of times the bathroom graffiti is an expression of either the anger or irritation that somebody is facing. So that's why they've scribbled, that like they're so angry and they need to get it out somewhere. And so they write it in the bathroom. So bathrooms then do become a space for you to sort of literally let out your frustration. Now here, of course, this becomes an indicator again of surveillance. It becomes an indicator of that lack of freedom. The idea that you have it in the most basic of places and nowhere else. And that's heartbreaking. But what's also interesting is that right after this, you have the sense of passage of time, right? We fought the summer heat, the winter snow. So it's like there has been a passage of time and we've come to a realization of ourselves. And that's a very important realization, because the realization is when we discovered we ourselves were the language. Because you are your language. You are a representation of your identity. You are the best ambassador for your identity, for your linguistic identity. And so it's the idea that we have to take responsibility. And mind you, that is an idea that has been continuing from the first stanza. The idea that you are personally responsible for your identity. No third party is going to do it for you. No one on the outside is going to do it for you. You have to take your own responsibility. Now, the thing is that it's a very profound realization that, you're responsible for your fate, you're responsible for your freedom, your own identity. But there's another side to it, because immediately the response is violent. It's like our tongues were removed, we start talking with our eyes were poked out, we talk with our hands. It's like increasing acts of violence, because the thing is that any system of power would be frightened by this kind of resistance, because it's a resistance of defiance. It's like, I have no power, but I'm still going to do this. It's really coming from that space. It's kind of like it irks those in power to sort of respond with excess violence, right? But the thing is, what has changed from the first two stanzas is that there are no more passive or survival mode. It's kind of like, sure, we're going to push ourselves out, because the idea is that they realize that they have to persevere. They realize that they have to sort of fight for it on their own. So even though the stanza goes back, sort of cyclically goes back to the first stanza, right? Because the idea is that we crawl back into the bellies of our sleeping mothers as if into bomb shelters to be born again. It's the idea that it's kind of like a cyclical return to the first stanza, all right? But there's a tone change. There's a proper tone change from the first stanza, which is a lot more passive, survival oriented, to one that's like, no, we have to persevere. We figured it out, So it's kind of, looks like it's winding back into that, but it's winding back into a sense of hope. And that's a very interesting thing that happens at this point in the poem, And that structural shift is important, because it does look like, because violence or repression is a cycle, and it will continue unless it's violently broken through. And does not, when I say violently broken through, does not have to mean that you return violence with violence, but maybe just this act of defiance in itself can break that cycle, right? And so here it's that realization that, hey, I do have power. I didn't realize it. And so now I'm going to speak, and I'm going to speak irrespective. That is a profound realization for them. And so that's really where it goes to. So that tone change is important, which is why when you come to the fourth stanza, it's again a tonal shift, because the fourth stanza brings us back to the gymnast. And there on the horizon, the gymnast of our future was leaping through the fiery hoop of the sun. This is a complete shift. The first gymnast is a gymnast on a thin thread of the horizon was performing there. It's like, precarious, not clear. This gymnast is very confident, sure. It's like leaping through. It knows. It knows it can do it. It's not worried anymore. It's no more in the sense of like, oh, where am I, tottering towards nothing. It's like, I know, I'm certain, I'm sure. And that's a very important space for the gymnast to sort of land. We also sort of realize that even the choice of using the gymnast in both scenarios is very interesting, because the first gymnast, the unsure, or the gymnast without an identity, is also very reflective of athletes or gymnasts that performed when USSR functioned. So back then, when USSR was there, most of the athletes who performed, they performed under USSR, irrespective of their personal affiliations with their birth countries, whichever it might be. They were always seen as Soviet athletes, Soviet gymnasts. They didn't have an identity that was uniquely their own, irrespective of what they said. But here, now that history has moved on, now that things have shifted, they can claim an identity. They can be Belarus. They can be themselves. They can stand for themselves. They don't have to, tag along with somebody else's identity. And so that's a very important shift that she's representing for us. So, like I said, it seems like a cycle, but the cycle has broken. And that's really important in how the poem sort of functions. So even though it does become a pretty violent, gory kind of, seeming end in the third stanza, the fact is that you have them coming back up, right up. And so it's kind of like a phoenix kind of narrative of here. So it is surprisingly a very hopeful kind of a text. Now, the thing is that there is a lot of chaos and fragmentation, as mentioned before, but you can see, like I said, towards the end, it's all stitching together. It's all coming together. It's like we didn't know identity. There is this, a representation of devastation. There's a representation of, deprivation, all of those things. And then, lack of clarity, which is all there, that first answer. And then in the second, there's this distrust, fear, surveillance, the kind of fears that come out of not necessarily only logical reasons, but also illogical fears, like, oh, somebody's watching me, somebody could be watching you, but there's no clarity on what it is. And so that kind of atmosphere of anxiety, which the second stanza stands for, to then, when you come to the third stanza, where it's a very blatantly resistance segment. It's like, you know what, we're gonna fight. And it also ends on this very hopeful note, because the idea is that to be born again, we're gonna come back, we're not giving up, we have figured out that we can do this. Maybe we're not going to succeed now, but we will succeed eventually. So in that sense, it also reminds me a lot of John Agarth's Pan Recipe. John Agarth's Pan Recipe is, again, a very interesting poem, because it's kind of like this recipe, but for resistance. How does resistance come? Sometimes that chaos, that anxiety, that marginalization, that deprivation, that violence has to sort of foment and then build this urge to fight back, and it's going to be a slow process. Of course, in Pan Recipe as well, it ends on a really, charged note. It's sort of implied violence, but like we already said, violence need not necessarily mean actual physical destruction alone, but can also be that active defiance, because there is no way for us to sort of say if poets are necessarily advocating a certain thing, but the fact is that that violence could just be breaking status quo, right? So it's a very interesting take that we have over here. The thing is that what's also interesting about this poem is that it still remains relevant as a text, though things are changing. There are a lot of reports on how Belarusian is more actively, there are citizens more active in, promoting Belarusian, in speaking it, and the government seems to be making attempts at sort of, promoting it, but not very obvious attempts, so it's very soon to say. So it still continues to be a relevant poem, but hopefully someday it should just be a reminder of something that had happened in the past and is not necessarily the case. But the thing is that I believe linguistic fights will constantly be relevant, because even culturally, like even in India, you have a lot of linguistic related debates that are constantly happening. Depending on your city, depending on which part you come from, there is constantly a debate about, should this language be spoken, should that language be spoken, what is our language, what is our identity. So it's going to be a conversation. And so in that sense, even in the larger context, even if, say, in Belarus, Belarusian gains parity, a text like this, in its context of linguistic identity, may always remain relevant. Now, on a very interesting side note, the poem is called Belarusian I, but a lot of the early representations of the poem, since they used the Roman numeral, a lot of people used to read it as Belarusian I, which is not the title of the poem. If you were to check out the recording by Valzhyna Mort herself, and she very clearly says Belarusian I. But even the idea of calling it Belarusian I is a very, very, in the larger context of the poem, it makes so much sense, because I am my language, right? Because that's the central part of the poem. When we discover we ourselves were the language, that is the central idea of the poem. So technically, even if it was Belarusian I, it would make a lot of sense, though that is not actually the title of the poem. But we see how she sort of managed to convey a lot of these profound ideas through strong metaphors, through very hard-hitting language, and conveys a very palpable sense of how your language is tied to your identity and how you need to do anything and everything to sort of reclaim that space. So it's a profound text, still relevant, like I said, not just in the context of Belarus, but I think right across in any place that's sort of having a debate on language, a poem like Valzhyna Mort's Belarusian I will always be sort of a very significant text. There are, of course, many other ways a text like this could be read. It could also sort of be tied up with other resistance poems. As mentioned, John Agarth's Pandar's Bee is a really good idea to do sort of a comparison with. Of course, that has more to do with the social scenario of oppression as opposed to linguistic oppression, but that could also be tied up with many other kind of narratives from different spaces that could be tied up with a text like Belarusian I. Thank you.